The true origin of the oil economy, what historians get wrong. In 1908, a Ford Model T cost around $850 and could travel perhaps 20 miles on a gallon of fuel. That fuel, gasoline, had until very recently been treated as a nearly worthless waste product, poured into rivers or burned off, because the only part of crude oil anyone wanted was kerosene for lamps. Think about that for a moment. The substance that would become the most strategically valuable commodity on Earth, the thing nations would fight wars over, build and break empires around, and anchor the global financial system upon, began its career as garbage, something refiners threw away. The story we usually tell about oil is a story about energy. Oil powers our cars, heats our homes, runs our factories. It is fuel. That is true, and it is also the least interesting thing about it. Because here is what should stop you. Oil did not just power the 20th century, it reshaped it. The map of the modern world, the outcomes of its greatest wars, the value of its money, the rise and fall of its empires, all of it was bent, quietly and profoundly, by the control of this one black liquid. Oil is not merely a fuel. It is a form of power, and whoever controls its flow has again and again gotten to write the rules for everyone else. This is the story of how a waste product became the master resource of the modern age, and how it rewired war, money, industry, and power itself. It begins, as so much of the modern economy does, with a discovery, a frenzy, and then a single ruthless man who imposed order on the chaos. In 1859, in a quiet corner of Pennsylvania, a former railway conductor named Edwin Drake did something no one had done before. He drilled a well specifically to find oil, and he struck it. Before Drake, oil was gathered where it seeped naturally to the surface, skimmed off streams, collected in pitiful quantity. After Drake, it could be pumped from deep in the earth in volumes previously unimaginable. And what followed was one of the great manias of the 19th century. Prospectors flooded into Pennsylvania. Boom towns sprang up overnight in the mud. Fortunes were made and lost in weeks. Wooden derricks covered the hillsides and forests of timber. It had the same wild, chaotic energy as a gold rush. And like a gold rush, it was violently unstable. Wild swings in supply sent prices soaring and crashing. One month a man could be rich, the next, ruined. This was the turbulent, lawless young industry into which a quiet, calculating bookkeeper from Cleveland would soon step, seeing in all that chaos not danger but opportunity. In this era, oil meant essentially one thing: kerosene for lighting. And the man who would master this chaos was John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller did not invent drilling. He did something far more consequential. He understood before almost anyone else that the real power in oil was not in pulling it out of the ground. It was in controlling everything that happened after. Rockefeller focused not on drilling, but on refining, and above all, on transportation. He cut secret deals with the railroads, extracting rebates that let him undercut every competitor. He bought up rival refineries one after another, sometimes offering a fair price, sometimes crushing those who refused until they had no choice but to sell. He integrated everything, the barrels, the pipelines, the refineries, the distribution, into one vast, coordinated machine. His company was called Standard Oil. By the 1880s, Standard Oil controlled around 90% of America's oil refining. It was one of the most complete monopolies in the history of capitalism, and it made Rockefeller the richest man of his age, arguably the wealthiest in modern history when measured against the economy of his time. But the fortune is not the point. The method is. Rockefeller had proven a principle that would echo through the next 100 years. The deepest power in the oil economy does not belong to whoever owns the oil in the ground. No, it belongs to whoever controls the flow, the pipelines, the refineries, the shipping, the narrow choke points between the well and the customer. Ownership of the resource is common. Control of the flow is rare, and it is everything. Nations would spend the coming century learning and relearning that same brutal lesson, sometimes at the cost of war. Standard Oil grew so dominant that in 1911, the United States Supreme Court ordered it broken up into more than 30 separate companies. But this was not the defeat it appeared to be. Those fragments became some of the most powerful corporations of the next century, companies whose descendants we know today as ExxonMobil, Chevron, and others. The monopoly was shattered into pieces, and each piece grew into a giant. Rockefeller had done more than build a company. He had invented a template. Thus, the vertically integrated corporation controlling every stage of an industry from raw material to finished product, the use of scale to crush competitors, the marriage of business with political influence, all of it was pioneered or perfected in oil. The modern multinational corporation in many ways was born in the oil fields. And the sheer scale of wealth and power these companies accumulated meant that for the first time, private businesses could rival governments in their influence over world affairs. When we talk today about corporations powerful enough to shape the policies of nations, we are describing a world that oil, more than any other industry, first brought into being. But even as Rockefeller was building his empire on kerosene for lamps, two new forces were about to make oil not just profitable, but decisive. The first was a machine. The second was a war. The machine was the internal combustion engine and the automobile it powered. Suddenly, that worthless waste product, gasoline, became the most sought-after substance of the new century. The lamp was being replaced by the electric light bulb just as the car created a vastly larger thirst for oil. The industry pivoted from lighting the night to moving the world. And the automobile did not just consume oil, it reshaped human civilization around oil. Consider what the car made possible and what it made necessary. Entire cities were redesigned around the automobile. Sprawling suburbs spread outward from urban centers, viable only because people could drive. Vast networks of highways were poured across continents. Shopping, work, and home drifted apart, connected by ribbons of asphalt and the assumption of cheap fuel. A whole way of life, especially in the United States, was constructed on the premise that a tank of gasoline would always be affordable and always be there. This is a crucial and underappreciated point. Oil did not simply slot into the existing world as a better fuel. It rebuilt the physical shape of the world to suit itself. Yidi. The distances people live from their work, the design of their cities, the food shipped across oceans to their tables, all of it was arranged around abundant, cheap oil. This is why the oil economy became so difficult to escape. It was not just an energy source we plugged in. It was the hidden blueprint according to which the modern world itself was constructed. And then came the war that changed everything. And this is the turning point most histories rush past. When the First World War began in 1914, the armies of Europe marched to battle on foot and on horseback, much as they had for centuries. But over the 4 years of that war, something revolutionary happened. The war became mechanized. Trucks replaced horses. The internal combustion engine moved men and supplies. Tanks, a brand new weapon, crawled across the battlefield. Aircraft took to the skies. And navies made a fateful transition, converting their great warships from coal power to oil. That naval shift, championed in Britain by a young Winston Churchill, was enormously consequential. Oil-fired ships were faster, had greater range, and could be refueled at sea. But Britain had coal at home and no oil of its own. By choosing oil, the world's greatest naval power made itself permanently dependent on oil from abroad, above all from the Middle East. In that single strategic decision, you can see the entire future of 20th century geopolitics taking shape. By the end of the First World War, a profound truth had been revealed. As one British official famously put it, the Allied cause had floated to victory on a wave of oil. Whoever controlled oil could move armies. Whoever ran out of it could not fight. Oil had become the lifeblood of modern war. And here we have to pause on something the fuel story leaves out entirely. Because oil was quietly transforming not just how nations fought, but how they lived. Crude oil is not a single substance. It is a dense soup of chemicals, and in the 20th century, chemists learned to pull those chemicals apart and rebuild them into almost anything. And from oil came plastics, the cheap moldable material that would eventually touch nearly every object you own. From oil came synthetic fabrics, detergents, paints, solvents, and the raw material for countless medicines. Most importantly of all, from oil and natural gas came synthetic fertilizer. Through an industrial process for pulling nitrogen from the air, powered by fossil fuels, humanity learned to manufacture fertilizer on a massive scale. This shattered the ancient limit on how much food the land could produce. It is not an exaggeration to say that a large share of the people alive today are fed by crops grown with fertilizer made from fossil fuels. Oil did not just move armies and machines. It began invisibly to feed the human race. So by the early 20th century, oil had woven itself into the deepest fabric of modern life. It moved the world's transport, it powered its factories, it clothed its people, and it fed its growing billions. A civilization was being built, layer by layer, on a foundation of petroleum, right? And a civilization built on a single resource is a civilization that can be controlled or strangled by whoever commands that resource. And nowhere was this lesson written more starkly than in the war that followed. The Second World War was, in a very real sense, a war about oil, driven by the desperate scramble of nations that did not have enough of it. Consider the two great aggressor powers. Germany had almost no domestic oil. Hitler's entire strategy was shadowed by this weakness. The German drive deep into the Soviet Union was aimed, in significant part, at the oil fields of the Caucasus at Baku, without which the German war machine could not be sustained. The Germans poured resources into manufacturing synthetic fuel from coal precisely because they lacked the real thing. And in the end, fuel shortages helped ground the German Air Force and freeze its tank. Japan's story is even more direct. Japan had virtually no oil and imported most of it from the United States. When Japan's expansion into Asia led the United States to impose an oil embargo in 1941, Japan faced a stark choice: abandon its ambitions or seize the oil-rich territories of Southeast Asia and fight the power blocking its access. The attack on Pearl Harbor was, at its root, an attempt to remove the obstacle standing between Japan and the oil it could not live without. Both aggressor nations were, in the end, strangled partly by a lack of oil, while the Allies, and above all the United States, then the world's dominant oil producer, had it in abundance. The war confirmed beyond any doubt that oil was now the single most important strategic resource on Earth. Military power ran on it, and that realization set off the great scramble that would define the rest of the century. The race to control the places where oil came out of the ground. And by the mid-20th century, it was becoming clear that the greatest of those places was the Middle East. Beneath the deserts of the Persian Gulf lay the largest and cheapest to extract oil reserves in the world. And so, as the age of European colonial empires faded after the Second World War, a new kind of contest moved in to replace it. The Western oil companies, the descendants of Standard Oil and their European counterparts, struck deals with the kings and rulers of the region to extract that oil, often on terms extraordinarily favorable to the companies. For a time, a small group of giant Western firms, sometimes called the Seven Sisters, effectively controlled the global flow of oil, setting the price and dominating production across much of the world. The nations that actually sat on top of the oil received only a fraction of the wealth flowing out of their own ground. The producing nations noticed, and some of them tried to fight back long before OPEC. The most dramatic early attempt came in Iran. In 1951, a nationalist government moved to nationalize its oil, seizing control from the British company that had dominated it for decades and taken the lion's share of the profits. The response from the West was swift and revealing. Britain organized a boycott of Iranian oil, and in 1953, British and American intelligence services helped orchestrate a coup that removed the Iranian prime minister and restored a ruler friendly to Western oil interests. That single episode tells you everything about how high the stakes had become. A sovereign nation tried to control its own resource, and two of the most powerful countries on Earth covertly toppled its government to stop it. Oil was now worth overthrowing governments over. The bitterness that coup left behind would poison relations between Iran and the West for generations, and its echoes are still with us today. That imbalance could not last, and its unwinding produced the moment the entire global economy changed forever. The oil-producing nations began to organize. In 1960, several of them founded an organization to coordinate their policies and reclaim control over their own resource. It was called OPEC, the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. For its first decade, it was relatively quiet. Then, in 1973, it changed the world. That year, in the midst of a war in the Middle East, the Arab members of OPEC decided to use oil as a weapon. They cut production and declared an embargo against nations seen as supporting Israel, above all the United States. The effect was instantaneous and staggering. In a matter of months, the price of oil roughly quadrupled, leaping from around $3 a barrel to nearly $12. For the producing nations, it was a revolution. Trillions of dollars in wealth began to flow from the industrialized West into a handful of desert states, transforming them almost overnight from poor territories into some of the richest societies on Earth. Glittering modern cities would rise from the sand, financed entirely by the black liquid beneath it. Power, real geopolitical power, shifted with that money. For the first time, ordinary people in the West felt the raw power of oil directly. There were long lines at gas stations, rationing, and a sudden frightening realization that the comfortable modern economies of the West were utterly dependent on the decisions of a handful of distant oil-producing states. The post-war boom, built on cheap and endless energy, hit a wall. The result was a toxic new economic condition, stagflation, a simultaneous mix of stagnant growth and soaring prices that tormented the world for years. The 1973 oil shock was a hinge in modern history. It marked the moment power in the oil world began shifting decisively from the Western companies to the producing states, and it exposed for all to see just how completely the modern economy had been built on a foundation of oil. And it was not the last such shock. In 1979, revolution in Iran, one of the world's great oil producers, threw the markets into chaos again. Production collapsed amid the upheaval, and oil prices more than doubled a second time, triggering another round of economic pain across the world. Twice in a single decade, events in the Middle East had reached into the daily lives of people on the other side of the planet, dictating the price of driving to work. The lesson was hammered home with brutal clarity, and it changed Western strategy permanently. The industrialized nations concluded that the uninterrupted flow of Middle Eastern oil was not merely an economic interest, but a vital national security concern, one they would defend by force if necessary. In the decades that followed, that doctrine would draw Western militaries into the region again and again. When one Gulf nation invaded another in 1990, threatening a huge share of the world's oil reserves, an American-led coalition went to war to reverse it. Whatever the stated justifications, the strategic importance of oil was never far from the center of these conflicts. The pattern Rockefeller began and Churchill accelerated had reached its logical end. Nations were now sending armies to secure the flow of oil itself. But the deepest consequence of that era was not the price of gasoline. Well, it was something far more subtle and far more powerful that happened to money itself. To understand it, we have to go back a couple of years to 1971. In that year, the United States ended the direct convertibility of its dollar into gold, unwinding the system that had anchored global money since the Second World War. For the first time, the world's dominant currency was backed by nothing but trust in the United States. The dollar was suddenly just paper. And this is where oil performed its most quiet and most important act of all. In the years that followed, an arrangement took shape, sometimes called the petrodollar system. The world's oil, priced and sold overwhelmingly in United States dollars, meant that any nation that wanted to buy oil, which was every industrial nation on Earth, first needed to acquire dollars. Grasp what that did. It created a permanent, structural, planet-wide demand for the United States dollar, entirely separate from anything the American economy itself produced. The whole world needed dollars to buy the one commodity no modern nation could do without. Oil became the invisible anchor beneath the dollar, replacing gold. And the enormous earnings of the oil states, their petrodollars, flowed back into American banks and government bonds, financing American deficit. So oil did not just fuel the world's engine. It quietly propped up the world's most important currency, and with it, American financial power. The link between oil and the dollar became one of the hidden pillars of the entire global order, a pillar most people have never even heard of. And this arrangement had a further self-reinforcing effect.